no objection, we shall now debate. Resolved. Higher education is a bubble. Mr. Peter Thiel.
Talk about this for a few hours. We only have 25 minutes or something like this. I guess better make some good arguments here. In most debates about higher education are grouped something like this. The universities say they're bastions of free thought. The Republicans reply they're just bastions of left-wing thought. Universities reply, well, it's not our fault that all highly educated people happen to be liberal, and the Republicans have to brainwash them all to be communists. They don't know. But if we were sort of try to take a slightly orthogonal cut on this, if you got a room of Republicans and Yale professors, and you asked them, what is a viewpoint so left-wing that we could get a Yale professor fired? I think they'd be pretty hard-pressed to answer. But there is an answer. In spring of 2005, David Graeber, an extremely left-wing anthropology associate professor at Yale, got summarily dismissed. And his crime was basically, asking sort of a lot of questions about the nature of higher education, Yale in particular, probably where he sort of, the taboo that he crossed was he tried to organize the graduate students into a union, which was a left-wing cause. You were not allowed to do it, even at Yale. And it was, again, sort of an indirect way of asking some very, very uncomfortable questions about the nature of higher education. I'm not as left-wing as Mr. Graeber. I won't agree with all of his particular recommendations and the things that he suggested, but I think the kinds of questions that he asked are very important. Sort of like one simple heuristic I always have on speech is if you have ideas that are forbidden, and you're not allowed to discuss. My simplistic shortcut is you simply know they're true. And that's sort of like where I normally just end the discussion right here. So it's basically the fact that David Graeber got fired for asking questions about the nature of higher education. That proves it right there, that higher education level. I don't really need to say anything more. But just in case you want a little bit more of an argument, let's go into the terms of the debate and define the terms of the debate. So, how does one, how do you know about sort of like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's definition of obscenity? You know it when you see it, but maybe three kinds of clues that can get to the nature of bubbles. The first is that bubbles tend to have this aspect where they are extremely hard to define. They involve these incredible abstractions, and so that you sort of impose all these kinds of values onto them and project all kinds of imaginary fantasies onto them. The South Sea bubble of 1720 involved the antipode of the world from London, and so who knows what was on the other side of the world? It could be it could be a mountain of gold, it could be anything you could imagine. Probably there are elements of the AI discussion that are bubble-like, because AI, the next generation of computers, the last generation of computers, anything in between, it's so abstract, so undefined that that's one of the sort of pieces that makes it very, very bubble-prone. A second dimension, and these are all sort of complementary in different ways, is a financial component. That there's some kind of exponentially growing financial thing. Things that are exponential are extremely powerful, but extremely unsustainable. They eventually pop. They're very exciting while they last, and then it goes poof to zero at some point. The internet bubble of the 90s, the housing bubble of the 2000s had this sort of mass exponential financial component, and then often at some point some people are short a lot of debt, and it goes very badly wrong at the end. And a third dimension of a bubble, I would argue, a third clue that something's a bubble, is something like a psychosocial component. And it's a sort of mania, the tulip bubble of 1634 to 37, and sort of like the place where the wisdom of crowds clearly shifts over to the madness of crowds. Again, so there's so much fuzzy criteria, but it's something like in a democracy, you think the George Harrington was good, But if you get 99.999% of the people to agree with you, you're not a democracy, you're in North Korea. And so at some point, those are the madness of crowds. I think I will win the debate if I can meet any of these three criteria, but I'm going to try to prove that higher education meets all three. Hopelessly abstract. Secondly, runaway financial exponential cycle is unsustainable. And third, sort of crazy psychosocial component. So let's start with the first one, the incredible abstraction. And in setting up this discussion, this debate, we went back and forth a lot on the definition of a bubble, and I sort of went through this sort of three-part definition three-part test that I just gave you. But strangely, people didn't ask about higher education, which in my mind is actually a far more mysterious thing, much harder to define what exactly that is. And it's sort of this abstract catch-all term. It's not specific. The less abstract one would be something like, STEM education or computer science, or if you're just coding Python, learning how to code in Python, that's not hopelessly abstract. Higher education, man, that covers a lot of stuff. And it sort of obscures a lot of important distinctions. It tells you that there's no difference between Oxford University and Oxford Brookes University, both incidentally located in Oxford. You might suspect the confusion is almost intentional. Or Cornell University in Ithaca, and Cornell College in Iowa, UPenn and Penn State, Columbia University in New York, and Columbia College in Chicago. And of course, all these things are sort of funny ways of getting at the way that all this stuff gets, abstracted in a really crazy way. Often if you try to break it down, what is the nature of education? One simple version is a three-part way to break down is selection. Are you smart enough to get into Yale? Signaling. And you tell people that you were willing to go to Yale for 4 years, and so that it shows your employers that you're going to be a docile person and you're going to be a cog machine. And third, you actually learn here. And when people have done regressions on these things, about 45% selection, 45% signaling, and 10% actual learning. And again, if we de-abstract it, we get something very, very different. Or the other sort of example I give on getting at this question of abstraction. So like the Yale president, McInnes, she had a fantasy of wanting to get lynched by a mob of students and professors and administrators and alumni. Here's how she could do it. It's very straightforward. She'd say, well, we're just all about learning, and learning is a very positive something. And so since the Yale education is so fantastic, people are learning so much at this university. And, it used to be like, there were 200 million people in the U.S. in 1970. There are now 8 billion people in the world. And, we're not going to increase the enrollment by 40x. We're just going to increase it by 3x over the next 20 years. And I think people would be extraordinarily upset. And that is telling me that something very, very strange is going on. That maybe, maybe the value is heavily driven by exclusion or something like this. It's sort of like a Studio 54 night club or something like this. Even though I suspect it would be more honest if you call it a Studio 54 night club. I think it would be way more fun. And instead, we abstract. It's like in some ways it's an insurance policy, so you don't fall through cracks in our society. It's a tournament, a Malthusian tournament, Hunger Games thing to get in. So those are like risk reducing, risk increasing. Or if you think of it, is it an investment or a consumption decision? Is it a 4-year investment in your future, or is it a 4-year party? And these are like, again, two things that are quite contradictory. And in fact, we have all these stories that get told and get inflated all the time. Tells you that something endlessly abstract is going on. Obviously something can be an investment and a consumption decision and an insurance policy and a tournament at the same time. But the amount of mischief you can do if you somehow are able to pitch all four. It's like, again, think about it like in a housing bubble context, circa 2005. I'm buying a house with a big swimming pool, and this shows how frugal I am and how much money I'm saving for my retirement, or something like this. The investment and consumption decisions get deflated, and in practice, you end up having something that's neither a good investment nor a good consumption decision, nor a good insurance policy, and maybe the tournament isn't even one that's worth winning. Now let's go on to my second criteria. The way this abstraction links to the financial, the psychosocial bubble, the second and third, it's because education can mean everything and therefore nothing. We can project all these kinds of fantasies on it, and things can go very, very haywire. So on the financial question, let's just start with some of the basic numbers. Student debt in the United States was $300 billion in 2000, less than a quarter century ago. It's now somewhere close to approaching $2 trillion. And so there's some level where maybe this works. There's some level where it becomes harder and harder to sustain. In 2005, the same year that David Graeber gets fired at Yale, I think the U.S. government, the Bush 43 administration, started to realize that they had to take more and more extreme measures to sort of recoup these ever-rising debts. And in that year, something was passed called the somewhat Orwellian Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act. And among other things, what the law does is it prevents student debt from being discharged through bankruptcy. So if you run up a lot of student debt, and you cannot file for bankruptcy because obviously it's human capital. It's not like building or something else. And if you haven't paid it off by the time you retire, they will garnish your Social Security wages. And this is sort of like the way it got started to get locked in 2005. And by July of 2023. I always think of the New York Times as kind of like Providence, like complete nonsense. But even by 2023, even the New York Times had to sort of admit that things had kind of got haywire. It was a very informative article. America's student loans were never going to be repaid, is the title of the article. And it is basically, look at people graduating in different cohorts, and then the dynamic is you have a pile of student debt, and then you start making money, you start paying it off. Now people graduating in 1997, so it's sort of like a Gen X, sort of tail end of Gen X. 12 years later, by 2009, most of them owed less money than they had in 1997. So there was still, even though it probably cost too much already in the 90s, there was still some way people could sort of pay off. But according to this analysis in 2023, things always take a long time to figure out. It takes a long time to sort of do the retrospective analysis. Was that in the sort of turning point year was 2009. If you graduated in 2009, the interest on the debt actually compounded faster than your ability to pay it off. And so that the median person who graduated in 2009 owes more student debt today than they had in the year 2009. And indeed, if you aggregate all around, by 2020, something like 60% of outstanding student loans had a higher balance than when they were issued. That is to say, 60% of the people in student debt have not even made the tiniest dent into their debt. The somewhat polemical thing I always say is, the 1.7 trillion in student debt in aggregate, the first order just paid for 1.7 or $2 trillion worth of lies about the value of higher education. There are all sorts of things, one can debate about this. I think, the Biden-Harris administration attempt to forgive $400 billion in student debt. It's sort of like, it's like too little or too much, because if higher education is as great as they say, why not forgive all of it? Just admit everyone's been ripped off forgive the whole thing. And of course, if you have to forgive the whole thing, then maybe it shouldn't all be stuck to the taxpayers, and maybe you have to get something else to the university, something else to the people who lent the money, and it would force some kind of way to really, really think this thing through. So sort of the Machiavellian interpretation of what Biden here said was, and we're gonna try to pay off as much as we can without asking bigger questions about the value of education. And so here a set of things that happen. You know, there's obviously like a longer history. How did this bubble get started? Something like this. I think there's sort of a, you know, there's probably, you know, some rough generational narrative where it roughly worked for the baby boomer generation. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, college was reasonably affordable. The value of college education was much greater than a high school education. You could probably pay off your college costs by working in college, graduate without any debt, graduated in 1965 or 1970, and it kind of worked. And then the system sort of ran away. And 1980 or so is sort of the last year baby boomers entered college. Relative to today, the real costs, the real annual costs are 3 or 4 times as much as they were in 1980. And for the people who are opposed to the resolution, I would submit there are 3 possible explanations for what happened. You know, why did it cost 3 to 4 times as much in real terms as it did in the early 80s at the tail end of the boomers? One explanation is the colleges and the universities are 3 or 4 times better at educating you. The product has drastically improved. And I would like someone with a straight face to make these arguments later. Second, there was a massive market failure in 1980. And the colleges just charged way too little. There was just some crazy market failure, and they charged way too little. And then, the sort of the third explanation I have is that the institutions became sociopathic. And the proper way to understand this, one of my colleagues has this term that institutions have embedded growth obligations, egos for short, EGO. And an embedded growth obligation is we promise you there's going to be a certain amount of growth, and as long as growth happens, everybody can be better off. Like law firm partnerships, all sorts of institutions work. As long as there's growth, everything will work. And then at some point where the growth doesn't work, where the growth slows down, you have sort of 2 choices. One is you somehow try to reset people, it's Charles Dickens' myth, you don't have great expectations. No, it's very deflationary, but the thing that actually happens in practice is the institutions become sociopathic. They just lie. And they say it is still as good as it is for your baby boomer parents or grandparents, and you should just believe them. It still works as well as it ever has. Now let me turn to the third and final characteristic of the bubble, this sort of psychosocial mania. This is maybe the place where I'll, the first one maybe stressed a little bit more the general higher education one. This is sort of more what I think is the challenge for a place like Yale or Stanford, where I went, where it was just and again, my autobiographical version. This was in my 8th grade junior high school yearbook in 1981. One of my friends wrote in 4 years from now you're going to get into Stanford. And 4 years later I got into Stanford, and then I got into Stanford Law School, and then I ended up at a big law firm in Manhattan. And from the outside everybody wanted to get in, and on the inside everybody wanted to get out. Why did I get caught up in this, and what was it was probably all kinds of parental, social, insane kinds of peer pressures where, you just were not asking enough questions. If I had to sort of describe the elite failure at Yale, make an elitist argument, yes, you're told, you go to Yale or you go to jail. And I don't think going to jail is, that desirable. Going to Yale sounds better than going to jail. I'll concede that much. Should Yale be better than just not going to jail? Is your elitism so low that you're satisfied simply by being told that you're not like the other people in New Haven who all go to jail? It needs to maintain New Haven in a permanent dump-like condition to reassure the fragile egos of the about the nature of the bubble. The fancy Latin expression to make an elitist argument is corruptio optima pessima. The corruption of the best is the worst. And that, I had to sort of describe what I always think happens at Yale, Stanford, other elite universities is, you should always try to remember when you graduated senior year of high school and what your expectations were and your ambitions and what you hope to do, and then you should see where they are 2 or 3 years after you leave a place like Yale. And if they are still in the same place where they were at the end of your high school years, you are like, I don't know, you are Superman. Because the point of these institutions is to beat everything out of you, to cut down your expectations, to beat everything out of you in every way possible. And this is sort of what you need to resist all these ways. There obviously are all sorts of things one can say about the way these, I always think there are these different types of lies that Trump and Obama told, and I always find the Trump lies less obnoxious because he's sort of like a used car salesman. Whereas here's sort of the most offensive lie that I believe Obama ever told. And I don't know if it's immoral, I think it was probably morally okay, but it nevertheless strikes me as a very, very offensive lie. This was 2014, and Michelle told a similar one to this. So we tell Malia, who's their daughter who was in high school at the time, don't assume that there are 10 schools that you have to go to, and if you didn't get to those 10, that somehow things are going to be terrible. There are a lot of schools out there. There are thousands and thousands of great schools. And of course, Malia went to Harvard. I mean, it would be really disturbing if Obama actually believed this stuff. But the way this sort of lie works on an elite level, is that there is a sort of psychosocial bubble we have in a place like Yale, like Harvard, where we can't even talk about these differences between Yale and lesser colleges, but then it also obscures all the ways that Yale is no longer delivering on its elite promises. And we just start looking at the homeless people who live in New Haven or something like that, and that's supposed to reassure you that everything is fine. So to conclude, if you cast a vote for this resolution, you're casting a vote against the exploitation of young people saddled with debt. You're casting a vote against crazy boomer, anti-young people narratives that have inflated this bubble. And you are casting a vote of confidence in yourself. Confidence that one day, the fact that you went to Yale will be the least interesting part of your life.